Welcome to the Safety and Risk Success podcast with me, Christian Harris. I'm joined today by Peter Forshaw of Weightmans, and we're going to be exploring the safety legal landscape for 2024. Peter has been working in this field for a number of years and he's got clear expertise in this area. He's going to share with us some of the trends that he has seen over 2023, which set the scene for how we need to think about the safety legal space in 2024. If you'd like to learn more from Peter, do give him a follow on LinkedIn. Trust you will enjoy this episode, and I'll see you on the other side with my conversation with Peter Forshaw. Cheers.
Welcome to the Safety and Risk Success podcast with Christian Harris. We believe that proactive safety and risk management powers business performance. Each week we explore this theme, sharing guests, stories, insights, trends, hints and tips. You can find us on all the major podcasting platforms, and video versions are available on YouTube. But for now, let's join the conversation with Christian.
Stop sharing, and I'll welcome you to this Safety Roundtable session today with my guest, Peter Forshaw. I'm going to get Peter to introduce himself in a minute, but we're going to be talking today about some of the key trends that Peter's identified in the legal space as regards to health and safety. So what you need to know, what you should seek to do to address these things. We're going to be focusing on the UK because that's where Peter practices law, and most of you are going to be from the UK anyway, but some of these trends are going to be relevant to you wherever you are. So don't feel that it's a waste of time if you're not working in the UK. One other thing is we're not here to give legal advice on specifics or anything like that. So this isn't formal legal advice. We're going to be talking about trends and interesting things and what to look forward to and general thoughts on how to deal with situations that are happening rather than giving any particular specifics. So with that said, Peter, would you like to just give a quick bit of context to yourself, and then we can get into it?
I will do. Thanks, Christian. Good afternoon, everyone. So yes, I'm Peter Forshaw. I'm a partner at Weightmans, a top 40 full-service law firm throughout the United Kingdom. I am the casualty technical lead for Weightmans across all of our 9 offices, and therefore servicing insurers, corporate organisations, municipal organisations, and brokers in this space. Myself, I handle claims, defend claims for those clients from an ELPL perspective. So part of my role is obviously handling and defending claims as robustly as possible and as the evidence allows, and no doubt we'll come on to what some of that evidence that will allow that robust repudiation in due course. And then another aspect of mine is really, I suppose, as a turkey voting for Christmas, trying to support our clients to minimise their claims exposure, either through minimising the risk of incidents in the first place, or where incidents do arise, trying to maximise defensibility to avoid those claims progressing successfully. So yeah, nice to see you all, and hopefully we'll have a sort of good round table and lots of interactive discussion between us, because we've all got obviously relevant experience to share.
Absolutely. And if you're joining us on the Zoom and you've got any thoughts, comments, questions, just go to reactions, raise your hand, and then we'll call you up. We're going to have time at the end for kind of an open Q&A, but if there's any particular things that resonate with you or you've got questions about, then feel free to go into the reactions, and we'll call you up to have a chat with Peter. I'm not sure exactly how much solid legal advice I can give, but I can give a bit of my experience in the niche that I obviously work in on a daily basis as well. So let's start with something kind of macro that everyone's going to be aware of, which is what's going on with the economy. So I suppose the first question is there a relationship between economic performance and the claims landscape?
There is, and obviously it's I caveat everything I say by saying, I appreciate what I'm going to say is sort of gross generalizations, and there will be experiences both ways. But as a general rule of thumb, then yes, there is. When you had the banking crisis, in the first decade of this millennium, when you've got what's happening at the moment, that does tend to be a precursor to activity within the market, both in terms of what's affecting people in their jobs, but also what helps then drive claimant lawyers. And obviously, if you've got claimants wanting to claim, and you've got claimant lawyers or claims management companies encouraging them to claim, then that kind of is a perfect storm to mean that then you're hit with claims exposure and indemnity spend as a result of it. Even, you know, regardless of whether you're successful on the claim or not, there will be a base level of spend that you pay out or incur whenever there's a claim pursued. So there is a definite link between what happens in the economy and claims exposure.
Okay. Which makes logical sense, doesn't it? As you say, and a couple of the factors that you and I spoke about before as we were sort of preparing for this were around kind of insolvencies and administration. So what are the kind of implications on claims for that? Because I think you've worked in a few of these scenarios.
Yeah, so I mean, as we'll all have read, and I know there was an article, I think it was in The Guardian, sort of 2 days ago, really, in terms of where we're at with insolvencies at the moment. And I think we're seeing the highest level of insolvencies since the banking crash of 2009. And I think that's projected to sort of extend into next year as well at the moment with the sort of current economic forecasts. And I think that sort of brings in 2 or 3 different factors. I mean, the first thing is obviously there is a direct impact to the employees of those organizations. And so once you start seeing that impact on employment or indeed unemployment, and again, I think, you know, the stats at the moment seem to be showing us moving from, I think it was sort of 3.5% in the summer of 2022, projected, I think, going into 2024 to be about 4.85%. And okay, you know, it doesn't seem a huge percentage change, but obviously in the grand scheme of things, with the number of employees impacted, that is quite a large pool of people who will find themselves out of work. And the, you know, history shows us that there is a correlation between that sort of change to somebody's employment and claims, and that's, you know, aside from any sort of wider economic things that are going on in the market. But you know, there are claimants who will pursue claims, whatever. But there is quite a sort of rump of people injured in incidents, health and safety matters, who don't do anything about it because they have a loyalty to an organisation, because they are in a position where they're still in employment, they don't want to rock the boat, and they have allegiances to managers and everything else. Once that sort of safety net is stripped away, once they no longer have an allegiance because they're you know, no longer in employment, then the trigger starts to be there for them to think, oh, actually, hang on, you know, I've got the potential to make a claim here, particularly, as I say, if you've got media advertising, if you've got claims management companies and stuff sort of just stoking the fire and suggesting to people, you know, have you had an accident, etc., etc. So you've got that impact anyway. And then when you've got then the other driver, which is sort of the cost of living crisis and everything else at the moment, and then people really feeling the pinch in their pocket, there is an added impetus for them to then think, well, actually, I don't owe an allegiance anymore because my employer doesn't exist, and I've got an imperative that I'm short of cash. And if I've had an incident, then I'm entitled to make a claim in relation to that health and safety incident. And that's the genuine claimants. You then, you know, not even factoring in then the rise that we're starting to see and will continue to see in terms of those try-ons, those claimants who think, you know, I'm going to make a claim here.
Yep.
And you know, I think the other problem with the insolvency point of view is that you're also stripping away an aspect of defensibility, because you no longer have that organization, you no longer have the personnel who would be your witnesses to repudiate, you no longer arguably sometimes have the documentation to help you repudiate those claims. So you've got a perfect storm of people feeling more inclined to claim, and the situation where you are potentially, and we'll come on no doubt to defensibility issues, but you know, potentially faced with an issue where you've got less evidence to be able to support a repudiation. So it's a perfect storm, really.
Yeah, I mean, we've all heard stories of, people who lose their jobs and then suddenly a claim arises shortly thereafter. So I think that is something that we're kind of aware of. I suppose the part of the challenge here with this point is that it's one we can be aware of, but I guess there aren't many things we can do to kind of protect ourselves, because hopefully if we're on this call, we're not going to be in that situation where this happens to our organization. And if it does, we're probably not going to be involved anyway, are we? So it's probably one to be more aware of, I suppose, than any particular actions that we could take.
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, I think the other thing which maybe we can all bear in mind is that there's obviously a spectrum of activity that takes place in organisations in light of economic trading difficulties. And I suppose the other thing which we are seeing more commonly now, and I think again we'll probably see again over the next couple of years, again particularly as break clauses in leases and things like that start to arise, is that organizations are continually thinking, actually, what is the footprint that I need as a physical place of work? And so I think we do start seeing companies increasingly rationalizing their floor plate, rationalizing the number of sites out of which they operate, and that again triggers a consultation process with staff. You then get sort of staff leaving either voluntarily or through compulsory termination on the back of that, and that I think is where there is an area where there is definitely a role to play, because obviously you still have some people connected to the business, you still have the business trading. What you want to ensure is that what you are losing from the closure of a site or particular area of the business is preserved, and that's where I spend a lot of my time is helping organizations trying to preempt actually what is the information, who are the people I need to try and retain, or at least retain their knowledge and their evidence and their information for when that rationalization takes place.
Yeah. So there's a few things we can think about there. And the second point that you kind of alluded to is around this kind of the overarching economy and cost of living crisis and challenges around that, perhaps making people a little bit more keen to put in a claim, whether that's legitimate or maybe a bit more spurious. So from that perspective, I suppose there are things that we can do to try to be aware and guard against that. And I guess it's going to come back to the fundamentals of claims defensibility and being prepared.
Yes, and I think firstly being alive to those sort of points. What are the drivers that are sort of feeding into claims inflation and things like that, and then sort of being prepared from an evidential point of view, and really sort of collaboration. Again, I think that's an area that we can never spend too much time on in terms of a dialogue between corporate organizations or employers and the other sort of stakeholders within that partnership. So broker, insurer, ensuring that everybody's on the same page, ensuring that everybody has access to information and awareness of what's on the horizon, so that it can be planned for. But we're definitely sort of seeing with cost of living crisis and inflation, everything like that, then it's certainly been a move in the wrong direction in general terms, in terms of claim spend and the like. Yeah.
And I guess the supply chain is important as well, isn't it, from a partnership perspective? Particularly if you're thinking about things like slips and trips. My area, obviously, your kind of FM companies, cleaning companies, contractors on site. You need to be getting all of these people aligned and understanding where things are and where the processes need to be, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it all starts with the genesis of the relationship, in terms of the contractual position. And I think again, where there are clear reasons why, for example, organizations will want to give the impression that everybody on those premises is part of their organization, whether it's through branding or just sort of not making visible that these are cleaners or security guards or whatever else from other organizations. But of course that then has the effect of anybody who is injured, who suffers a health and safety incident, or indeed whoever causes a health and safety incident, the implication is straight away that the overall sort of premises occupier, the employer of the business, is the port of call, is the one to attack should something go wrong. And then what we see play out in various claims is that sort of ongoing sort of battle to and forth between, you know, the engaging contractor and the employer as to who should pick this up, who knew what, where, and when, and obviously those sort of third parties have got fluidity of staff just as much as employers have as well, and some, not all, I appreciate, but some of the issues could be resolved by actually having got a proper contractual basis to the arrangement and the contracting out of third-party services from day one. And there are still a number of times when I'll sort of say to a client who I'm acting for and say, okay, yeah, we accept that, you know, that slip that was created, or that you know, that issue that was left with a tripping hazard being left in the aisle, or the you know, however somebody was kind of approached and dealt with from a sort of harassment point of view. You know, appreciate they're not your staff, and you'll be very firm and understandably so that this is not an exposure that you should be picking up. But when you sort of say, okay, well, let's see the contract, let's see what were the lines of agreement in terms of the division of responsibility, where were the contractual indemnities, if any, and things like that. You know, I'm still surprised a little bit just how few contracts are even offered up, let alone when there is a contract in place, what the level of detail in that contract is. So I think that's something, whenever you are re-engaging with third parties, when you're recontracting and tendering out and things like that, I would just sort of encourage everyone to sort of look at that contractual basis from day one. It might seem, you know, it might seem to be over-egging it. It might seem to be too burdensome, but actually it will just make things so much easier down the line, should, God forbid, should something happen in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. Always better to be ahead of the game and get your ducks in a row to start with, aren't you?
Yeah, absolutely.
One of the things you mentioned there was claims inflation. Could you just explain the kind of concept of that, in case anybody isn't clear what it means, and then perhaps talk a bit about what's been happening in that space over the last, you know, couple of years? Yeah.
So, I mean, at its sort of very base level, what we're talking about with claims inflation is really the cost incurred in claims. So, again, I appreciate that it's not across the board, and I know that I'm sort of involved in books of claims, books of business, and work with certain clients where actually they have seen the average cost per claim reduce over the last few years, and that's obviously a really positive thing. And that could be because the nature of the book is changing. It could be because you're getting more repudiations on those cases. You know, there are lots of factors that feed into how a particular book for a particular client kind of plays out. But in general terms, what we are kind of seeing is this sort of creep in terms of average claims spend, and that's really what I'm sort of referring to in terms of claims inflation.
Yeah.
I mean, again, we can sort of come on to what sort of claims volumes look like, but I think when you take what's happening with claims volumes and what's happening with spend, what we're finding is, in general terms, fewer claims, but those claims are more expensive. Volume-wise, that's a good picture. Appreciate there's one or two sort of pressure points, but in general terms, there is that sort of plateauing of claims volumes particularly in the employer's liability, health and safety space. But it's that creep up of the claims that are being presented are more significant, either because of the nature of the injuries being sustained, or because of the different heads of loss now costing more than they did 5 years ago. And just to sort of give you an example, so and again, I don't want to sort of teach grandma to suck eggs here, so apologies if I'm sort of talking about things that you're fully familiar with. But in terms of one of the main heads of loss of a claim for personal injury is obviously the compensation for the injury itself that's suffered, and that's what we call general damages, and that's assessed or supported by judicial college guidelines that are reproduced periodically. And what we saw in April 2022, for example, is that the latest edition of that kind of introduced a general increase of about 6.5% to general damages. And then what we've also sort of seen since then is court authorities saying what was kind of implicit in the Judicial College guidelines, but probably ignored more than it was followed. But case law since saying, that is a guide. That's the starting point, and that as you go on, further in time after the latest edition has been published, then increases linked to the RPI should be factored in. So
Okay.
not only have you got a 6.5% increase through the 2022 figures, but actually if you then have a case adjudicated in 23-24, then there is the potential for a court to say, and we will factor in RPI increases on top of that. So once you start looking at even just on the basic injury itself, you can then start seeing why cost of claims is rising, because you've got these percentage increases factored in. And then, I suppose you've got other points there as well. We've touched obviously on insolvency and what's sort of driving more claims, but then you've got the impact on wages. So again, probably seen in the autumn statement announcements around new national minimum wage rates. You've got the largest ever annual increase to the national minimum wage. You've got wage inflation now sort of close to 8%. So again, any claimant who is introducing a claim for loss of earnings, again, those percentage increases are going to be pushing up what sort of potential value you're going to be paying out on that. And I suppose at the moment we're in the sort of worst position. So if you think now that you've kind of had this steady increase in that wage inflation, and that at some point during 24, possibly 25, it's going to plateau down again. Well, the difficulty is if you get somebody who is injured in a health and safety incident right on the cusp of that peak, then the earnings that are taken for their sort of pre-accident benchmark are at their highest point. What they are going to be saying, even if they're back in work, but arguably if they're off, is, well, look how my income has gone down as a result. And part of the role will be actually working out what elements has gone down because of the injury that is preventing them from working or working in the same way or doing full duties, and what is the reduction that would have been applied in any event, or the slowing down of the rate of pay increase that would have arisen in any event. And we have the same sort of considerations, of course, through COVID as well, where again we had to think about, well, yes, your income might have reduced, but did it reduce because of the pandemic and was affecting everybody, or did it reduce because you just unfortunately happened to have an accident, health and safety incident during the period of the pandemic? So again, there are those sort of factors that need to be accommodated within the consideration. You touched on a moment ago about supply chain. Obviously, the supply chain in terms of claims relies on a number of other individuals, whether they be engineers, whether they be medical experts, whether they be care providers, rehab providers, things like that. And I think because of our sort of national economy picture at the moment, and also because of worldwide events, Ukraine, Gaza, COVID, Brexit and the like, all those sort of individuals have had pressures, albeit slightly different ways, but pressures put on them, which then has an impact on claims. So what we have found is that the labour shortages that we're suffering in this country in certain areas at the moment is impacting on things like care. So that automatically then triggers care becoming more expensive, and sort of in the region of sort of 15% or so is kind of a ballpark figure of how care costs have increased. So again, if somebody's suffering and needs care in response to their injury, then that increase is going to have to be factored into the award that's paid out. And similarly as well with medical experts, there is a decreasing talent pool, I think, post-COVID. I think we've lost, as indeed all organisations have to some degree, I think we've lost some technical expertise and some experience. And therefore waiting lists are getting longer to have claimants seen by medico-legal experts. There are disciplines at the moment where, if I try to ring up, I don't know, a pain expert tomorrow, I might be being told, well, we can give you an appointment in 2026. And therefore, arguably things stall until 2026, until you can get that appointment put in place. And naturally, cause and effect, if there are fewer people who've got that expertise, they can probably charge more for it. So again, the fees that you incur to get that medical expertise or whatever are inevitably going to increase as well. And then we've also got the situations with the courts at the moment, which is also having an impact on claims inflation. So I think it's probably fair to say that we've got the biggest backlogs in the court system that we've ever had in this country, and no real appetite to sort of directly throw money at releasing that problem. Cases stacked up, periods longer to issue claims, periods longer to get claims heard for hearing, which again then is prolonging the lifetime of a claim, and the longer the lifetime of a claim, then obviously the cost of the claim goes up as well. And there are obviously representations from this government in terms of how they're going to deal with claims process going forward, compulsory mediation, ADR, and this push with some speed now to get claims processes sort of fully digitalized through portals and the like. But the fact still remains that things are taking longer than they did in the past.
Yeah, that's very, very comprehensive list of all the drivers there. Do remember, by the way, guys, if you've got any questions you'd like to ask, feel free to pop them in the chat, or if you're on the Zoom with us, go into excuse me, reactions, raise your hand, and you can come and have a chat with Peter. I had to make a personal injury claim a few years ago, or 10, 11 years ago now. I was walking down the pavement when a car came around the corner too fast, lost control, mounted the curb and drove along the pavement and into me. And I remember with that at the end of the day, it came down to a good old-fashioned negotiation where, we said we believe it's worth X. The insurance company said we believe it's worth X minus a large amount, and we ended up sticking to our guns, and we pretty much got what we wanted. But I suppose the challenge here is going to be that if you've got the claimants sort of with all of these inflationary pressures upping and upping and upping the money that they're demanding for these claims, and then the insurers and the lawyers and the corporates trying to keep those costs down, at some point if that gap keeps getting bigger, the settlements will be rising, won't they, naturally, unless people really say, no, I'm not going to stand for this and I'm going to take it all the way to court, I'm going to try and win. But obviously there are then risks to that as well. So is it almost inevitable that this is going to be a challenge for the coming years?
Yeah, I mean, as you say, that there are different philosophies from both sides. I would, as a defence lawyer, I would naturally sort of say claimants are always going to hold out for as much as they can get, but I appreciate that there are lots of factors that impose a reasonableness on claimants to think, well, actually, I might not get that. I need to be reasonable, or there are other drivers to for them sort of trying to settle the claim, or indeed, increasingly discontinuing claims. I mean, the repudiation rates on, again, certain books of business, is quite high for different factors. And again, that might be a symptom of the point I made before about spurious claims, because more spurious claims, you do tend to get more discontinuances and people walking away at some point. But yeah, I think it's inevitable that you will sort of get that, as you always have, that sort of impasse to some degree between obviously those who are trying to, I wouldn't say minimize the spend, but to value the payout at what it is genuinely worth on the basis of the evidence, as opposed to what a claimant might want.
Yeah, I mean, so many of these things are open to some kind of interpretation, aren't they? I suppose that's the reality of the situation. And if you say that there's a starting point for the general damages, but there's a bit of wiggle room there, and straight away, you're going from, I remember there was a kind of a booklet, and it said, if you lose a finger on your dominant hand, it's worth X, and if it's on the other hand, it's worth Y. But again, if there's even wiggle room in that, then I suppose that is creating potential for conflict in terms of the agreement or otherwise about the quantum, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I mean, yes, you've got that sort of percentage increase, which is almost sort of non-negotiable, and what those increases do over the years is then just move the bracket of damages just further along the scale. So inevitably you're getting a higher payout because of that percentage increase. Where it then falls within that kind of extended bracket, then, as you say, becomes a point of negotiation or judicial determination.
Yeah. Mike, you've got your hand up. Do you want to come and ask a question?
Yeah, please. There are two things. I'm also very interested to see the answer to CJ Brown's question in the chat as well. I think that's a very good one there. But I just really wanted to make a point of my experience as well, that we are experience a massive slew of hearing loss claims. In fact, I think in the last 6 months, I think I've dealt with 14 of them from retired workers. And I think we've been able to repudiate pretty much every one of them because we've got very good records and we've got a very good system that we've had in place since the 1980s. But the sheer volume of time it takes me to produce all this data for each of these defenses, it absolutely kills my time. It makes me so angry that I've got to do this again and again. And yeah, that was just what I wanted to share with the group.
I feel your pain, Mike. Yeah, I mean, that actually, I suppose, kind of leads in quite nicely actually to the point around fixed recoverable costs, because I think that is the reason why you've seen that increase in deafness claims, because the rules around disease claims and when fixed recoverable costs will apply differ between diseases and accidents. And we have seen across the market organisations and their insurers reporting increases in disease claims being presented in the run-up to October of this year, albeit to give us some comfort, I think the general mood music seems to be that the peak wasn't as high as maybe was anticipated within the market. So that's, let's try and take the benefits where we can. But yeah, as you say, any claim that is presented, no matter how spurious and no matter how capable of defending it is, it still takes time and money.
Yeah, a couple of people in the chat have been asking about have there been increases in claims for health related issues such as lung damage from exposure to dust?
I don't think I mean those sort of disease type claims or prolonged exposure claims. I don't think that my colleagues who sort of deal with those day to day have necessarily seen a stark increase. I think though that, I mean, one of the things I was going to sort of say in terms of where we go in 24, 25 is that probably is going to be an area where we will start to see a bit more activity. And I think that's because there is, I think, a heightened awareness from other things happening in the country and sort of a focus on environmental issues, air pollution, and the sort of the recent sort of tragic inquest where air pollution was linked to the death of that young girl. That I think people are more focused on lung related issues, and I think again COVID has probably fed into that as well. And I don't think it's any sort of coincidence that I know the HSE have sort of just announced that in the manufacturing sector they are going to be focusing up to March in terms of looking at manufacturing processes and chemical exposure and lung damage in the workplace. So I think, yeah, we will start to see, I think, a bit of an impact on that, but I don't think we've necessarily seen it yet.
Yeah. And you mentioned COVID just then, and at the time there was a kind of fear. I heard the phrase a tsunami of COVID claims coming through, as in, I've caught COVID, Mr. Employer, and it's your fault, and I want to sue you for it. And that doesn't seem to have happened in any great volume. I haven't heard much about that. Is that fair?
I think that is fair. Yeah, I mean, I think again it varies by sector, and I think where you're dealing with employers in the sort of the care sector, the health sector, then we probably saw more claims presented. But yeah, I think in terms of manufacturing, retail, leisure. Not saying there weren't claims presented, but I think the volume of claims that were feared, and that fear was partly borne out by sort of hearing what claimant law firms were doing in terms of gathering teams of people up in one central location to really market COVID claims as the next PPI or whatever it was. That just doesn't seem to have happened. And where I was just looking at one of these the other day, because it was one we just concluded, but where claims in those sort of sectors were presented, then the odds really were stacked up against a claimant because of how many factors they would need to prove. So the one I was looking at the other day was somebody who claimed that they'd contracted COVID because of poor sort of isolation and distancing procedures in a factory, and we just got that one withdrawn because we were able to show that firstly that there were procedures in place, and therefore what the claimant was saying in terms of how often they'd worked with other people who did contract COVID was extremely limited. And then secondly, we were then able to put a picture together of where this individual claimant had been, and actually we knew that she'd been in an environment where COVID was also prevalent, away from the workplace and everything else. So again, on causation, we were able to defeat it as well. So I think for all those reasons, that we hadn't seen that spike in COVID claims across the board that was feared.
Yeah, which I think is a good thing, because I think it would be, a difficult phenomenon to overcome, wouldn't it, if that had happened as people had feared. Yeah. So moving on then to defensibility. We've spoken about defensibility a lot, and obviously in many of these cases we're speaking about things that have happened, and we haven't been able to prevent something, and therefore what can we do to be in the best position to either repudiate the claim, or at least, if not, minimize the cost of it. What in your experience would you say are the three areas in which companies, organizations tend to do pretty well when it comes to defensibility, and what would maybe be the three areas that you see are common as areas for improvement?
Okay, right. I think the first thing I would say, and I fear it's slightly changing, but in terms of where we have been to date, I think having identified people who are focal points for supporting claims repudiation, responsible for incident investigation, responsible for kind of collating everything together, and therefore being in the best position to say, right, here is everything that we've got, here is everything that we will need to be able to defend this claim, I think has been well managed. The reason I sort of put that sort of caveat on is that I fear that, and certainly from anecdotal evidence that I sort of hear from people, is that there is increasingly a sort of bit of an expectation in some areas for people to start assuming that sort of role as an addition or a bolt-on to what was, their other role. Maybe as rationalization has taken place, as people have retired, businesses have sort of thought, well, actually, you can do that on top of doing this, that, and the other. And so there needs to be a realization as to how reasonable that is. But I think in terms of activity, then that is good. I think in terms of most organizations that I deal with, there has been a huge improvement over recent years in terms of sort of documentation and retention, and of course, helped by moving away perhaps from paper systems onto sort of digital systems that can hopefully be accessed not just because something's sat in somebody's U drive, but is actually on an accessible system that numerous people can get access to. I think that has been a huge change. And I think, going back to Mike's points, when we sort of saw that first peak of noise-induced hearing loss claims, I don't know, probably about 8 years ago, maybe 10 years ago, something like that, we were dealing with periods of exposure that went back to the sort of 1960s. Well, again, you then started meeting organisations that said, "Oh, we probably did have noise surveys. I couldn't tell you where they are for that period, 40 years down the line." Whereas now I think we're in appreciate probably exposure is more recent anyway, but we're in a far better position in being able to access that information and get that evidence and things like that.
Okay.
So, and I think, again, most organizations take health and safety seriously, and as indeed they should. And I know it sounds a sort of a really basic thing to say, but it is front and center. We do have nominated people. I appreciate it can sometimes be a challenge for those people to get proper engagement from their boards or the senior managers to really keep health and safety at the top of the agenda, particularly with all the other competing issues like even keeping the business afloat. But I think we do in this country take health and safety seriously, and I think when you look at where our sort of health and safety stats are compared to the rest of the world, I think we're in a good place. And certainly as we saw that relaxation of bureaucracy that probably the Conservative sort of government introduced around sort of 2012, 2013, and there was that fear that from the claimant community, this is going to mean that health and safety is going to disintegrate and we're going to see far more accidents and everything else. It just didn't happen, and that's because we still, as a community, took health and safety very seriously. So I think they're the top three.
Okay.
Good.
And sort of any common areas where you often find there's areas to improve?
I think one thing I would say in terms of documentation is very good. I think sometimes we maybe struggle with version control. So we might have the latest version of something, but obviously we might be looking at incidents that happened 3 years ago. There might have been 2-3 changes of document, risk assessment, everything else since then. And being able to get hold of the right version that happened, was in place at that particular point in time is a bit of a challenge. I think the risk assessment process and what I would say is sort of as a subset of that, really, I suppose the dynamic risk assessment process. We are now in a situation where it seems to me anyway, we are increasingly reliant on individuals kind of almost doing their own day-to-day sort of assessment on top of what the business has done generally. And that's partly because workplaces are so dynamic, but also because people are now working in lots of different locations. The whole, for those of us who are fortunate or unfortunate, depending on your point of view, to be able to work in an agile way means that, we are working at home, we are working in a physical office space, we might be then going out on the road and going into other organizations' premises as well. And that's become far more fluid over the years. And I think, I don't think there's any sort of substitute for just making sure that everybody is alert to and able to kind of assess their own workplaces, wherever that workplace could be. And I think that's something that probably is a continual work in progress, really, for organisations. And then another point I would make would be a kind of a link between health and safety and culture, and particularly around HR. So again, where I'm sometimes a little bit surprised is where I will speak to an organisation for whom I'm defending a claim. And they will, understandably have a real frustration about what happened, either because this person was somebody who was kind of had previous incidents or near misses, or was a bit problematic in other ways. But when you then look at, so how did you deal with those previous instances? Did you discipline them? What did you do in terms of the workforce to sort of keep changing that culture and sort of stamp that out? I'm sometimes surprised that either that's not done or it's not possible to document what was done. And so I think that, there's no substitute for having a strong alignment between what's happening from a health and safety perspective and what's happening from a sort of HR policy and procedure perspective. And I appreciate that, in a lot of ways, HR has to stand separate and be isolated from and deal with things confidentially. But I think in this area, it's important that if things have not been done properly in the past by individual staff members, that actually HR and management are kind of seen to be and do actually deal with those instances as they arise, even if they didn't give rise to a sort of a full incident and therefore a claim, but at least we can then show a pattern of, we didn't condone anything, because once we were aware of things happening, we dealt with them.
Yeah, good stuff. Well, a few takeaways for people to consider there and try to go away and implement. Had a question from Naomi in the chat. What advice would you give us as we present some of these real facts and figures to the business? She's saying specifically workers, but I'd like to introduce also up to the board as well, to help it hit home and to help them to sort of not become a statistic, as it were.
Yeah, good question. I mean, I suppose from a sort of staff perspective, there are probably a few messages that you can use depending on your particular organisation's situation. But at the end of the day, any incidents impacts on lost time, impact on production, impact on if somebody goes off as a result of a safety incident, then those duties and responsibilities need to be picked up by others. I know, having dealt with claims where the spectre of fundamental dishonesty, even if it's not necessarily proven, is there. That actually there's a real agitation and disgruntlement from staff, thinking, how dare a colleague of mine try and present a claim in this way. So everybody is impacted through different ways by an incident, a health and safety claim, and I think for both the board and the staff, at the end of the day, as we've talked about before, everything comes with a cost, and that cost has to come from somewhere. Now, I mean, obviously insurance policies are in place for this sort of thing, but they don't always cover it. They might not pay out. The terms of the policy might not be such that it relates to that particular instant. There may well be a fairly high deductible that will be paid by the company in an event. In disease claims, it might not be possible to trace the full history of insurance cover, so there'll be periods being picked up by the business themselves. So everything has a cost.
And also the insurance costs, with everything that you've spoken about around claims inflation, are going to be going up and up the more claims you have anyway as well. So you might be sort of kicking the cost can down the road a bit, but you're still going to have to pay for it.
Absolutely, yeah, and that equally applies to the board. And then obviously, the board themselves, obviously have their own duties and responsibilities, and ultimately the sanctions around corporate manslaughter and the like in the most serious instance that are going to hit them individually. With some of the situations at the moment, if you get a major incident, and I'm not necessarily talking about health and safety now, but you could look at things like data loss as well and things like that as we become ever more data rich. If you had a data loss as a result of your management and processes and procedures, I mean, it's not unforeseeable that could take out your business ultimately, given what ends up being paid out. So very real, serious concerns for board and staff alike, it seems to me.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. Nicola, I didn't know if you've asked a great question here about stress. Did you want to come and unmute and ask it, or do you want me to ask it on your behalf?
Yes, thanks. Yeah, so we've been told informally by the HSE policy lead that they're going to be coming in and focusing future inspections around stress. So they've been threatening us with, this approach for many years, going back several years. And I'm just wondering, has Peter got any more insight into this, please? Is it likely, or what? Just to gather your thoughts, really.
Yeah. I haven't personally heard that from the HSE, and again, it's something I can sort of speak to my colleagues about, to sort of have probably more direct contact with the HSE. But it wouldn't surprise me. I think it's probably fair to say. I mean, if you look at the stats at the moment in terms of stress and workplace related issues in that regard, then that is one of the areas that really stands out, that we've seen over the past few years, a real increase in it. I mean, I suppose that said, the results that came out recently show it having kind of taken a slight dip again. So maybe, hopefully seeing things going in the right direction there. But I mean, it is clearly a major hotspot for employers, and therefore, arguably, understandably, I can see why it might be on the HSE's radar.
Yeah, I mean, I was at a conference last week, People Sustainability Summit, and mental health and stress and all of these things were very, very high up on the agenda there from a global perspective. And I can see actually Naomi has put her hand up just to give a bit of context about this from an Australian perspective. Naomi, do you want to just give us a overview of what's going on for you?
Yeah, so in Australia, we're actually already rolling this out, and we put it under the banner of psychosocial safety. And it's basically making sure people mentally feel okay to be at work in exactly the same way that you physically want them to go home in one piece. You also want them to mentally go home in one piece. So this is where a lot of the actual workplace culture pieces come into play, not so much the physical safety. So basically you're attacking things like excessive workloads, excessive demands, workplace bullying, and it's attacking all those kinds of aspects. How you mentally feel when you're at work. And we're doing it very, very successfully. So it's common practice now. We're not just in our safety shares, for example, we're not just, I'm actually in the middle of preparing one for tomorrow in staying safe on the holidays. So yes, I'm going to say to people, when you're on the roads, or when you're in the last little bits in this lead up to Christmas before we have 2 weeks off, make sure you're looking after yourself and you're staying safe. But at the same time, in implementing that psychosocial aspect, I'm saying, how are you looking after yourself mentally? So in this case, I'm bringing in a circle of control and a circle of influence kind of thing. You can go and look up those details on that, and basically inputting those safety measures in, and how they're going to look after themselves physically, but because it all starts with your mental aspect as well. So and giving them these little mental moments kind of thing to just stop and think about how they're feeling about what they're doing, not just what they're physically doing. And it seems a little bit disjointed. It seems a little bit bizarre when you first roll it out. But it's actually really successful, and it's actually building on your workplace culture, not just your safety culture, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah, no, I love that. Thanks, Naomi.
I think you're on mute, Christian.
Sorry. Thanks for that, Naomi. That was a great segue, actually. Thank you for that, into the last couple of things I wanted to ask you about. So the approach there to mental health is one that we're trying to be preventative, but also, I suppose, at the same time, be building up an evidence base so that down the track, if something does happen, we can evidence and prove that we had taken reasonable steps, and so on and so forth. So, in this big context of claims for safety-related issues, is prevention the best answer? Is the best strategy to be trying to be preventative, and is that how we can also help to be better at defensibility?
Absolutely. I mean, if you can prevent something arising in the first place, whether it's an incident, whether it's a stressful occurrence or whatever, then that has to be your ultimate goal. The other stuff we talked about in terms of documentation and witnesses and preservation, all that sort of stuff is kind of your safety net should something go wrong. But absolutely, prevention is the best route. And I think particularly on the stress thing as well, as an employer, as part of your ESG credentials, there's a sort of an employer's duty, a moral duty to ensure that actually people's well-being is good. So yeah, definitely agree with you on that one.
Good stuff. And then that point from Naomi worked as a segue into another point, because I was going to raise mental health had it not been raised, but it has. Are there any other, from a kind of horizon scanning perspective, any other trends that you kind of can foresee, coming at us in 2024 in this space that we should sort of start to perhaps be aware of?
Yeah, I think I think we will continue to see kind of some of the areas that I think have been a focus for the last sort of 12 months or so. So I think falls from height, segregation of pedestrians and vehicles, I think will still be a relatively sort of key issue. I think manual handling, musculoskeletal disorders will start to sort of become even more prominent again in 24, in light of, again, the sort of HSE focus on that. We've touched on sort of lung disease, air quality, as I say, that I think we'll perhaps see a little bit more of. And then I think, I suppose another thing that we are seeing on the rise, and I sort of put this under the banner of hostility, but it's it's aggression, it's extreme full-on violence, or horribly sexual assaults, things like that. I think, and again, I personally think this is another sort of well, there's a number of factors here, but I think COVID's played a part. I think there is a rising kind of feeling of entitlement with more people in this country, that I can do what I want, and nobody can tell me otherwise. I'm sort of sovereign over my own being, and also there's a sort of an immediate demand. So I think anybody who is in a public facing role, I know we've started to see it already, but I think that will probably continue going into 24. I don't see that easing off anytime soon, sadly. So again, employers I think need to sort of plan around that. I suppose the other thing as well is around this whole concept of AI. I think we are starting to see conversations happening about all its uses, AI and insurance with underwriting, all that sort of stuff. And I just think that every organization needs to think, how is AI going to be used by the organization at a senior level, but also how can we and should we be alive to individuals using AI, whether it be artificial or augmented intelligence, in every part of our business. So for example, if somebody new comes into your business and you task them with writing a new risk assessment or a new health and safety policy or whatever else, to what extent is that individual going to use AI to do that? To what extent do you have governance around that, so you can regulate the use of it? You can work to ensure that there are no inherent biases, or that it's not giving you the wrong answer in terms of what you do. So I think those are sort of issues that even in a health and safety context, we're going to have to grapple with, and soon, so that we are ready for when it really becomes prevalent. Yeah,
no, that's great, and you've also provided a great segue, because we're having a small break from the safety roundtable now for a month due to the Christmas period. But the first topic back on the 10th of January is going to be, what are your priorities for the year ahead from a safety perspective? And then we've also got a couple of sessions lined up talking about some of the continuing and developing trends in AI as well. So right. Yeah, it's almost like we scripted this whole thing out, which we didn't.
We absolutely didn't. So
no. But that's been great, Peter. Thank you so much for that. Just to finalize things then, if anybody wants to get in touch, what are the best ways to do that? Is it LinkedIn, for example? And also, do you have anything else you'd like to plug? Like if you've got any events or white papers or anything like that coming up, then the floor is yours for that.
Okay, yeah, so very quickly, probably the best way is if anybody wants to drop me an email, or indeed, find me on LinkedIn, but otherwise just ping me an email. I'm more than happy to sort of support you with any question or query that you might have. And then, yeah, again, if you want to get in touch, we are, as an organization, we run sort of various campaigns and seminars and things like that. And one of them actually is a continuing campaign on mental health and well-being in the workplace, and we sort of bring in psychiatric experts and other organisations talk about their experiences and things. So in these days of GDPR, we've got to be very clear in who wants to receive this information. But if any of you want to sort of join some of those ongoing discussions, then please do get in touch and I'll add you to the list.
Good stuff. Well, thank you very much for that. Great discussion. Lots of really good insights there and practical things for people to go away and have a think about. So really do appreciate that. And I appreciate everybody in the audience as well for joining us, not only today, but for the other sessions this year on the Safety Roundtable and on the podcast and all the LinkedIn engagements and all those good things as well. So if I don't speak to you beforehand, wishing you all a very merry festive season and look forward to seeing you back on the Safety Roundtable again on the 10th of January.
Thanks for joining us on the Safety and Risk Success podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please hit follow and do share on social media. Does anyone you know spring to mind as a great guest, even yourself? If so, please contact us on podcast@slipsafety.co.uk. See you next week for another episode.